In 1901, a guy by the name of Harry Augustus Rolt of Surrey, England, published a book called Grayling Fishing in South Country Streams. Now, I'd never heard of Rolt, but it turns out he was a bit famous for coming up with a series of flies called the witches. And I had vaguely heard of these patterns. I say vaguely because I couldn't find them in any of my books, except one. Collins' Illustrated Dictionary of Trout Flies by John Roberts, first published in London in 1995. Now, this book has been on my shelf for a couple of years, but I've never really explored it. So I'm thinking that might change because after flipping through it for a little while today, there are a lot of patterns in here that I'd like to try. So do I recommend this book? Well, kind of. I mean, it's not a how-to book, but there really are just a lot of cool patterns in here. And as of today, in June 2023, you can find used copies of it out there from anywhere from $3 to $8. And the first one I'm going to tie out of this book is called Rolt's Witch. Now, it is not a pretty fly. In fact, it's pretty utilitarian, just 3 materials, not counting the rib. Now, I did see one other version out there, but it was tied with the standard collar hackle. And the picture in the Illustrated Dictionary had it tied as a palmered hackle. So that's what I want to do today. I'm pretty much considering this a wet fly, so I'm going to tie it how Roberts had it tied in the book. And who knows how Rolt originally had this thing tied, but I'm kind of on a wet fly kick here lately, so I'm going to go with this palmered hackle version. So there it is in the vise, a Rolt's Witch from his 1901 book on grayling fishing. Now, I should have mentioned in the intro, this is not a real pretty fly, but sometimes the uglier flies are the ones that are the most effective. Now the recipe says 14 or 16. That's the size 14, 1 extra long barbless dry fly hook. And I'm going to lay down a base of black thread back here to the start of the bend. And the tail, just a little sliver of red floss. So I got about an 1.5 inch piece right here. I'm going to catch it in and then fold it over. We'll trim it in just a second. And just cut it, not too long, not too short, kind of noticeable. Now I'm going to bring my thread up front, catch in the rib. Now I'm using a small wire here. I suppose the color of it doesn't really matter. It's not going to be visible. So whatever color you want here should be fine. I'm just going to catch it in up front. Really no need to. I could have caught it in at the back because we do have a big Peacock herl body. But we're going to catch in all our components back here before we start wrapping any. Now, one tip on flies like this, catch the materials in the opposite order you're going to use them. So we're going to wrap the herl, then the hackle, then the rib. So you want to tie it in the rib, then the hackle, then the herl. And this, it called for a honey dun. Now, I'm not really even sure what a honey dun is, but the color of it, it looked kind of like a light brown. So I'm going with the ginger here, and this is a barred ginger. I think it'll be just fine. Now let's take about 3 strands of Peacock herl and spend some time picking your best herl if you want, or just grab the first 3 pieces off your little pack and not worry about it. Should be able to just break these right there. Now we're going to wrap it all the way back. And here's a tip that I often talk about when tying with multiple strands of Peacock herl. I leave my thread hanging about the middle. That way when we wrap these, you don't have to spin them together. And if they start spreading out on you, that thread will hold them in place. So just go ahead and wrap them up, however tight you want. Get it as thick as you want. Take it up here to the front and catch it off. Now these stems are getting a little thick up here, so I'm not going to try and break them. Just go ahead and snip them. Now let's wrap this hackle. And not really close together, not close together at all. We're going to palmer it up, but very open wraps. And I should have mentioned that this thing was originally tied as a dry fly or a wet fly. And you can kind of see that in here, that it looks, how it's tied, it looks like it would float a little bit, but it also looks like with just a tiny bit of split shot, this thing would sink like a rock. So I'm going to palmer it up about like that right there. So I think that will keep the intent that this thing could be fished wet or dry. Now about the only tricky part is wrapping this rib up there. You're going to trap some of these fibers. It's going to be unavoidable, but I'll just zigzag it through the best I can. 4 or 5 wraps to get me up front. Now I got a big gap right there, don't I? I must have trapped a little bit more than I wanted, but you know, I rarely tie perfect flies and think it's going to be just fine. But as tied, I think this one is much more a wet fly than it is a dry fly. But that's okay. Let's just pull these back and try to make a little room for a whip finish here. Now since this was a pretty quick tie, let me show you another little tip I do sometimes. After snipping off those long ones right there, if you've got this little thread burner, this little thread zap, pretty cheap device, it does a great job of burning or singeing any of these hairs right here around your eye. So you'll want to do this before you put the head cement on it, because it will kind of melt your head cement if you're not careful. But really just a couple of seconds and you clean up your eye nicely there. And now we can put some head cement on it, put this thing in our box. So there you go, a Rolt switch. Pretty interesting looking pattern. Again, not real pretty, but you know, certainly not hard to tie. So I appreciate you watching, everybody. Y'all take care and we'll see you next time.